Hello, and welcome to The Distillery. I'm your host, Harry Lee Shanglun. I'm streaming from the unceded lands of the people of the Kulin Nations. Today, we have special guest Judy Anderson, the CEO of Startup Victoria, which is a not-for-profit supporting founders and startups. Hey, Judy, how are you doing?
Hi, Harry. I'm good, thank you. How are you today?
I'm doing very well. I had a nice sleep in where I missed my morning exercise, and I'm all the better for it.
You got to do that sometimes. I also had a sleep in this morning and I feel a lot better for
it. We're in the middle of this massive pandemic, and I feel like I just want to give everyone full permission to sleep in as much as they'd like forever.
That's it. I think some people are still wearing their sleeping outfits like full time, right? Like the newscaster uniform where it's like business on the top and like trackies on the bottom.
Oh yeah. I mean, I'm wearing trackies on the bottom, so you've pegged me correctly. Judy, you're the CEO of Startup Vic. Can you tell me more about what that is and your role there?
Yeah, sure. So Startup Victoria is, as you said, a non-profit organisation that's set up to support founder success here in the state of Victoria. We started off as a really scrappy meetup group called Lean Startup Melbourne back in 2014. What started off as a few entrepreneurs getting together for beers on a Friday night to talk shop turned into a few hundred people, then it turned into a few thousand people. And if you fast forward to today in 2020, we've got over 25,000 people in the Startup Vic community, which makes us the largest entrepreneurship group in the country, which is really exciting. And our role in the startup ecosystem is to support our local founders and aspiring entrepreneurs. So very much a grassroots independent group where we're not funded by government, we're funded by our members. And we deliver products and programs to actually help founders both develop their businesses and also grow personally as well.
That's awesome. And it makes sense thinking about growth of organizations that you've seen such a huge groundswell. Who is an entrepreneur?
Oh my goodness, that is a big question. Well, I mean, some would argue that everyone can be an entrepreneur, and some would argue that you're born, an entrepreneur or not. I believe what makes you an entrepreneur is you have an idea and you do something to build that into a business. And then whether that business succeeds or fails is more about how successful you are as an entrepreneur. But I believe if you're an entrepreneur, you're someone who sees a problem, comes up with an idea to solve it, and you almost have this maniacal obsession with making that a reality and changing the world in some way, shape, or form, and ideally, hopefully, for the better.
Yeah, and I'm curious about this not caveat, but hopefully for the better situation, because the world of business is always linked to the political and the ethical, and it's in conversations that we've had in the past. It seems like this is something that you really strongly believe in, that the capacity of business and entrepreneurship to do social good. Where does that come from, and what do you think that capacity is?
Oh, absolutely. I think business can be a force for good. Like that phrase is actually stolen from a wonderful investment business here in Victoria called Giant Leap. And their slogan is business is a force for good. And they invest in companies that are fusing business and profit with purpose. And so I think that is definitely the future of business. At least I'd like to believe so. And it's driven from a few things. I think it's driven from, the overall consumer trend of people being a bit more aware about their purchasing behaviors and the impact that their buying decision can have on people and planet and their communities. But I think it's also driven by the change in, the changing guard of who are the people who are leading those companies. And, as this next generation is getting more experience and getting older and wiser, they're stepping into more management and leadership positions and taking those values, and then they're being driven throughout the business as well in terms of how they operate and what their values are. So I think it's definitely the way of the future. In terms of where it comes from for me, I don't know. It's just kind of always been there. I think, I don't know, I like to think, most people are good at the core, and I think it's just about anchoring that and being really conscious about the decisions you make and knowing that you're probably never going to get it perfect. I think it's just kind of always been there, probably from my upbringing. I don't know.
Do you mind sharing a little bit about your upbringing and how you came to this position of CEO of Startup Vic?
Sure. I have, full disclosure, lived a very, very, what I believe is a very privileged life. I sort of won the the lottery in many ways in terms of where I was born and, you know, who my parents were and where they were living in the world. So I was born in New South Wales, so grew up in the Blue Mountains, if anyone knows where that is. You know, popular tourist spot with the Three Sisters. And basically my upbringing, there wasn't a lot of tech around. There certainly wasn't a lot of entrepreneurship around. You know, our weekends and family holidays were going for bushwalks and camping in, you know, in the Jamison Valley. So that was kind of my upbringing, like very, very scrappy. Like you had to make your own fun. Like my mum was a primary school teacher and my dad was a railway engineer. He's a mechanical engineer. And so my mum was always into sort of like debating, creative, you know, tournament of the minds kind of things. And my dad very sort of mathematical and scientific. And I guess just being the daughter of the two of them, it was like this perfect storm, because then I became fascinated with problem solving and communication and people. You know, like for example, my mum would always lose her glasses. Like she was the person in our family that would always lose their glasses. And, you know, we find them everywhere. We'd find them in like the couch cushions in the driveway. And like my dad actually he pulled them out of the cutlery dishwasher rack once. I'm not sure like how they fell in there. I don't know.
So have they been washed?
Yeah, they were very clean. But this was a problem that I wanted to solve. I think I was like, I don't know, like 8 or 9 years old or something like that. And so my dad helped me. We went down to the local hardware store, bought a soldering iron, and we put a tracking device on her glasses frame. And then we put the finder button on her car keys. So anytime she lost her glasses, rather than, you know, going to us for help, she could just press this button and then her glasses would flash and make a beeping sound so she could go throughout the house and find them herself. So like that's the kind of stuff. And even like my dad would go to his idea of playtime was he'd go to a garage sale, you know, buy an old computer, bring it home, and then we'd take it apart and then put it back together again. So that was, I guess, the kind of stuff I was exposed to from a really young age. So I kind of feel like I was set up for this career, like to always be fascinated with like how things work and building things. And the only other thing I would maybe add is that my parents, you know, they certainly weren't, you know, well off. Like, they're still working and have friends and family, so I don't want to throw them under the bus or anything, but like they certainly didn't have a lot of money. And they were always personally striving to increase their, I guess, happiness and get to a good baseline of being able to have a home and, you know, go on a family holiday every now and then. So they were always really, really hardworking. And I think that also just got distilled in me as well.
It sounds like it's this perfect storm of values and interests that led you here. And I'm particularly interested in your characterization that you didn't grow up with tech or entrepreneurship as necessarily models. So when did you discover that world or that culture, and how did you take to it?
I discovered that world at university. So I chose to study entrepreneurship at RMIT, so my family moved to Melbourne when I started high school for my dad's work. And then ironically, he got made redundant and had to contract in Sydney for the next 2 years. But Melbourne definitely became home for our little family unit when I was about 12, 13. Normal high school sort of life. And then when you get to the end of high school, right, like you're faced with this fork in the road, you know, it's this like big decision point where you choose what you're going to do with the rest of your life. And of course, like you're 18 years old, you have no idea who you are, let alone like what you want to do with the rest of your life, nor like what you're really that good at. And so for me, something I was always fascinated by was business. Like just one of those subjects in high school that just really came naturally to me. It didn't feel like, you know, hard work as opposed to like biology. I wanted to like blow my brains. I wasn't very good at it. So I started studying entrepreneurship. And that's where I started to get exposed to like-minded people who were interested in building things. And it just so happened that the way to build things was no longer with a soldering iron and, you know, well, it still can be, but, you know, in that community, it was more about building things with tech. So that's kind of where my first interest into that world started.
I think I remember coming out of high school and having that same, oh my goodness, there's so many things that you could do and so many things that are fulfilling and meaningful. I ended up studying medicine for a few years as my first degree. And I just remember talking to someone who said, I've wanted to do this since I was 6. And I thought, so you've let a 6-year-old decide your life? Like not in a bad way, but just like this kind of...
Yeah. I think if I did what I wanted to do when I was 6, I'd be a chef. And I'm not very good at cooking, so I don't know very well, you know.
Yeah. Do you have advice for somebody maybe in a similar situation? You know, they're coming out of high school and they're looking at entrepreneurship as an option, or maybe they're later in life and they're thinking, how do I start a business about my passion?
Absolutely go for it. Like this is the future industry. Like whether you want to be the founder and you want to be the entrepreneur, that's totally up to you. But even if you're just interested in the space, because I personally find it fascinating, because entrepreneurs and founders are solving problems that are really big and that are really complex and that matter. You know, they're not just trying to make big companies bigger. They're trying to build something that they really care about. And even if you're not the founder, being someone who has, I guess, you know, very tolerant of chaos and working in that space to also help, you know, even if you're just working in an early stage company or working alongside a founder, that's really energizing. I think it's a field of work that doesn't feel like work a lot of the time. Like, don't get me wrong, it's a lot of work, but I don't know, the age-old saying, like, right, like if you do what you love, you won't work a day in your life or something like that. Like, I think that's been true for me. Like, I really love my job. I remember actually my first like corporate job, so to speak, you know, once I finished entrepreneurship and I finished my degree, it turns out studying entrepreneurship is a really unemployable degree back when I studied it. And I needed a job, you know, like I wasn't ready to start a business. And through a series of events, I ended up working in the innovation team at Deloitte. And it was just so much fun. It's like you take a problem that someone had in the business and try and find an innovative solution. And I was like, this is so much fun. Like I'm working with people who are really passionate. I'm working on problem solving. And I remember telling one of my friends who I'd met through uni, who was also working at Deloitte, I was like, this is so good. Like, I can't believe I get paid to do this. Like, I would do this for free. Like, I would come in and volunteer. And then he looked at me, he's like, never say that again. Like, so, yeah, that definitely happens. True story.
So maybe the distillation there is, if you want to be an entrepreneur, find the thing that you're really passionate about that you would do for free and then charge a lot of money for it.
Yeah, exactly. Because someone, like, even if you don't think, you know, even if you don't want to charge, like, it's still adding value. Like, there's still a value attached to the work that you're doing, even if it feels like something you might do for free. And I think there's a whole can of worms there around, you know, the in-kind industry that kind of still sits very much at the core of the startup community, especially when you're early stage doing favors. You know, you'll know this from speaking gigs and things like that. A lot of people do things for free if you don't already have a track record, and I think that's quite an unhealthy culture we've got to work to break.
It's something that I definitely recognize in creative industries. People who want to, for example, break into the games industry are often looking for unpaid internships or opportunities to do spec work for free through competitions. And yeah, I agree with you. It is unhealthy for the industry as a whole. I'm curious to maybe dive into that a little bit more even. What do you think are the problems that the startup community and industry and culture are facing? What are like the top 3 barriers?
Ooh, from the perspective of a founder, or just more generally like the industry?
I think we can even either look at it from critique of industry as it exists and what it should become and the gap between them. I think that's more what the question is about.
Yeah, sure. And I'm not sure if you can hear my neighbor's dog barking, but sorry about the background noise.
Totally fine.
Home life. So I think the main barriers to the startup sector growing and becoming, you know, like some of the blockers that I think we need to remove to help it grow. One is just the amount of capital that's floating around in Australia compared to other ecosystems in the world, like, you know, famous ones, Silicon Valley, London, Berlin, Singapore, Tel Aviv in Israel. There's just significantly greater amounts of investment capital. So investors, whether they're angels or VCs or otherwise, giving cash and injecting cash in exchange for, you know, some sort of ownership or involvement in the business. It's just not happening at the same velocity that it happens in other cities. We're definitely working on it, and it's being worked on by local investors who are being incredible thought leaders and pioneers here in Australia who are building it. Government policy writers working on it. Founders are calling for what they need here at a grassroots level. but we just don't have the same amount of cash floating around in Australia. So that's one thing. Another thing would just be startup density, so the amount of people starting startups, even though it's increasing significantly, especially off the back of the COVID-19 pandemic, we still just don't have the same number of people starting startups. So even though it's seen as like a up and coming industry and it's getting a lot more popular, like people are starting to know the terms scale up, startup, unicorn, things like that, it still is a little bit fringe for most industries. But again, that is being worked on and it is progressing, but it needs a bit more. And then the other thing is just how rich those startup ideas are. Like how big are those visions? And I think a lot of startups in Australia are still defaulting to thinking quite small. So testing, Australia is famously known as a great market to test a new startup because they're kind of like a mini market compared to, the US and Europe and some other places in the world. So I think the mindset of, I'll just test that it works here first and then go somewhere else. But you can start a global business from day one. So like the scale of vision for people who are starting a business, I think could really take a level up. And also just how technically based they are. We do have a lot of, I think we have a lot of startups in Australia where they've got the label of a startup, but they're really a small business or a lifestyle business. And that's awesome. Like having your own business and having it be a lifestyle business and have freedom and independence and control and creating something new, that is fantastic. You're still an entrepreneur. But if you are a high growth tech founder, that's a slightly different thing. Like you're looking to build $1 billion company that employs thousands of people and really changes the world. So I think we need more of that scale. That would be wonderful.
So it sounds like you're presenting a very hopeful vision of what startups can do, that changing the world and having a positive impact is the aim, and that some of the difficulties of being in Australia include funding and maybe the scale of ambition or the problems being tackled.
There's also other
which immediate.
Sorry, Harry, go on.
No, go.
I just say there's. I mean, it's not a full list, but other things like access to really great talent. Because our ecosystem is still quite young. We don't have access. There are reasons why that's not the case, right? And they all kind of need solving. So access to talent, people who actually know what the customer success role looks like, good engineering, good data scientists. Like we just don't have the same amount of talent as well, which is also contributing to those factors.
And all of these things, because they are thinking about the Australian environment, immediately bring to mind geopolitical questions, especially when you're talking about Australia seen as the safe place to test things, and that connects to our invitation culture, but also just like Australian culture. This might be a left field question. What do you think Australia's biggest strengths nationally will be or should be? Or maybe you can talk about Victoria because that's the scope that you operate in.
I think one of our strengths, like we do have like sectoral strengths that we're known for, like particularly in Victoria, like health and medtech. Even just one classic example, like the cochlear hearing aid, for example, like in terms of scientific innovation, we're quite famous for that on the global stage. Another thing Australia is really famous for is our developer talent. So our engineers and software developers, the quality of those software developers and engineers is world-class. Like, for example, we had, oh my gosh, why is his name escaping me? Jack from Twitter, the co-founder of Twitter.
Dorsey?
Yes, thank you. Jack Dorsey. I can't believe I forgot his name. When he visited Melbourne a little while ago, like he famously quoted, like he's like, when he spun out to start up Square, the fintech startup that he's now behind, when he was thinking about where should he start up the office in the Asia Pac region, Australia was a no-brainer because of our tech talent. So that's something we're definitely known for.
That's great. And because we've been talking about how this particular mode of social impact is possible, I guess I'm comparing it to other things like public sector or small businesses, but what are the specific affordances that a big startup has? Like what can that do that other things like public sector work can't?
Well, it can move a lot more quickly, for one. Because they're not accountable to taxpayer dollar spend, for example, like, so they can just there's less reporting, there's less red tape, there's less process for the sake of process. They don't have historical, I guess, things to manage, systems, processes, cultures. They can start something fresh, grow it really quickly, and then move really quickly. The other thing as well is that they're typically, until they get to a significant level of scale, they can pivot really quickly, because it's kind of, well, if something's not working, then the founder can just go, well, now the business is going over here. So they're not just stuck in doing what they've already committed to. And so just pace and the ability to pivot really quickly is definitely an advantage of a startup business, as opposed to an incumbent or a government office.
That kind of agility.
Though government offices and incumbents can be that, but it's a lot harder.
And is that just a cultural thing, or is it something structural?
It's both.
Or like a bit of both. Yeah.
It's structural and both. Yeah. So cultural. If I take one example, like let's say you've got a big company, it's well established, it's a leader in the market, and maybe it's got a partner.
I feel like you have somebody in mind when you're saying this.
Although maybe
I won't ask who.
And maybe those partners started off as grads, and then maybe that grad became an analyst, and maybe that analyst became a manager, and then maybe that manager became a director, and then maybe that director became a partner. And now they've taken the business, and now they get to decide which direction the business should go. And they've maybe spent 20 years building up to that sort of peak in that sort of pyramid structure. And now you're asking them to say, hey, you know what we should do? Rather than just keep doing what we're doing, which is quite profitable and continuing to focus on our current P&L, why don't we take some of that money and invest it in something new and something innovative? But we probably won't see the returns for maybe another 5 or 10 years, at which point you'll probably have retired, so you won't benefit from it. Or should we do that? Like, no, don't do that. So like, it takes serious commitment to the belief in the new thing, and a bit of sacrifice if you're in that kind of structure. And then there's little structural hacks you can do, like obviously like KPIs is a really big one. So if you're going to be rewarding people based on their performance, reward the things that are what you actually want to see in terms of change. So that's a really simple structural thing you could do.
Yeah, I think whenever you're measuring something, like a key performance indicator, paying attention to how we define the metrics of success and what we are incentivizing.
Totally. Because like what we see in a lot of big companies, especially the first time they bring out like an innovation program, would be like, innovation is really important. We want you to build new products and services that solve the problems of our customers. But your metrics are telling us something different. So having those align is just like 101.
I love also the focus on, I don't think you used the word, but I'm going to say experimentation, the ability for startups to do something a bit radical, a little bit risky. And your image of this pyramid structure of, oh, is this person who's worked their way up and retiring in fewer than 5 years really going to do that? Reminds me also of institutional critique of why it's really hard to change governments, or why it's hard to change policy. And I guess I'm reflecting on the moral dimension of this, of how we impact society. I personally think that we need more experimentation on larger topics, like how should capital work, or things like that. So having it in the micro scale as an experiment is really fascinating and exciting to me.
Yeah, experimentation is a must, right? Like if you're going to be building something new, for it to work, you have to experiment. You have to like constantly be figuring out what's working and what's not, and then changing based on what you learn. I mean, something that sprung to mind as you were talking, Harry, was I think there's definitely, if we want these massive societal changes, like yes, there's structural things that need to happen, and yes, there's cultural things that need to happen, but I feel like there's this, it's going to sound really woo-woo, but this like awakening that needs to happen at like an individual level in our culture for people to be incredibly self-aware with their motivations and why they're doing something and what actually brings them true happiness. Because we know from scientific research that humans are never done. It's like, the last time you went to go take that holiday and it felt really good at the time, and then, a little while, it like ebbed away, or like last time you got that pay rise or that promotion, it felt really good at the time, but then, you know, it kind of goes away. And you're as humans, we're always hungry for the next thing and the next thing. So I don't know what the answer is, but I think there's something in removing ego and like the psychology from progressive businesses and institutions. I think at the moment, and even in the startup founder model, right? It's like founders are often working towards an exit, you know, like a big payday where they can, you know, they've worked so hard building this business and they solved about the problem, but then their job really became less about the product they were building and the customers and more about managing that company. And so they're just like striving for that exit where they can get a nice big payday and then they've got freedom, you know, to work on something else, you know. So I don't know, I think I'm just kind of like talking through a problem. I don't know what the solution is, but I think there's something in there.
No, for sure. It's definitely reminiscent of conversations about labor and like if we lived in a post-scarcity world, what kind of work would we do? You know, what kind of thing would we do to, and this idea, big philosophical question of can we actually remove greed and from profit motive from business, and what that might look like if the world operated that way.
And if you can't, because I believe that you can't, because there are just like physiological, psychological things that have been in humans for, I don't know, forever, that, you know, in terms of how we've evolved, like, I don't know if we'll be able to do it in our lifetime. And so then for me, it becomes about how do you hack the system to actually favor those whose greed aligns with things that are good. Because I think at the moment, a lot of greed aligns with things that are bad. If I look at like even where most, you know, where most of super investments are being made, it's in oil and gas, gambling, and tobacco. They're significant investments of most people's super, and you know, a lot of people sort of super. Oh, that's something I don't have to think about. But like, if you want to make good consumer decisions, like think about where your super goes. Like, there's this incredible startup here in Victoria called Verve Super. It's a super fund for women, and they only do ethical investments. So they don't invest in the big, you know, oil and gas companies, tobacco, gambling, etc. They only invest in businesses that are for purpose and for profit. So you're still getting a profitable return. And I think even I think they shared some of their like results. They've outperformed in this current economic crisis than the normal players. So it's just little things like that. Yeah, you basically just got to hack the system, I think.
I love that. I love hacking the system. That's the t-shirt, you know?
Yeah.
I'm also imagining Judy Anderson at the helm of the monster of capitalism, like gently steering towards a better future. You know, like, oh, we're stuck with this evil system maybe, but like we can get good out of it.
Yeah. But I don't think I'm sharing anything like radically, you know. I feel like people have these thoughts all the time, right? It's like and I think something that is another big problem that would be great to overcome is this feeling very small, you know, and one fantastic outcome I think that has come from the crisis that is coronavirus is I feel like everyone is so much more civic minded than they were before. Like before, like I had so many conversations with friends and you know, and even family who just like weren't interested in politics. You know, it was just so removed from their world and they didn't think it had any impact nor, you know, people didn't think their vote counted. You know, like even something as simple as a council election, but, you know, even something as simple as a council election vote can change what happens in your local community, which can change how you experience your daily life and the opportunities that are available to everyone. So I don't know, I think, yeah, everyone is now just like watching with a very close eye, like what's Daniel Andrews going to say next in Victoria, you know, around restrictions, around coronavirus. So I think people are paying attention and I just wonder, how do we leverage that interest that we have now in a moment in time in people being interested in government and use that? Again, it's just a problem. I don't know what the answer is, but I think there's something there as well.
These are super good questions, and I'm very glad that you're thinking about them, and that through your capacity at Startup Vic, you're enabling other people to do the same. Judy, it's been a real pleasure to chat with you. Thank you for sharing your expertise and knowledge, and your perspectives and stories. It's been really good.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me. I could probably, as you can tell, yarn all day. But if anyone is listening in today and does want to learn more about the startup community and how to get involved in Startup Victoria, just go to our website, startupvictoria.com.au. It's a really good place to start. And yeah, we'd love to see you take the leap, join the community. Oh, thanks, Harry. That's great. That is
just quickly typing away.
the biggest plug I've ever seen. Thank you so much for having me.
Take care, Judy. See you. Do check out startupvictoria.com.au. Find out the really cool work, including some really great conferences that they organize. And thank you so much for tuning into The Distillery. I've been your host, Harry Li Shanglun, and I'm excited to see you again next episode. You can find us online at distillery.site. All the previous episodes are up there. Or check out our Twitter at distillery_site or our Instagram at distillery.site. All the best, everyone. Stay safe.